I know what you're thinking. What is active reading and how can it actually help me? Don't worry, it doesn't have anything to do with actual exercise. Unless you're talking about mental exercise, and even then it cuts down the workload significantly. Active reading is based on engaging the brain so that when you read, you retain more information, you focus for longer, and you don't fall asleep, which is like the primary goal of any student. Having been at university now, I understand the workload. I understand. I know the reading can be very intense, and it's very easy to switch off even if you don't want to. The active reading methods work to combat that. I found a video online and a few websites that talked about active reading, and I wanted to make a review on those techniques to see if they actually help you. Most of the active reading methods involve pre-reading and post-reading tasks so that you retain more of the information that you read. When I was looking through them, I realized that most of these active reading methods are basically just good revision methods. I used most of them when studying throughout my educational journey from GCSE to university level now, so they actually do help. But let's just jump straight into the methods. There are 10 in total. The first method is known as the ReadSummary Method. When using this method, it is important to think read, think, summarize. Those are the 3 key steps that you're going to be using when you use ReadSummary Method. As the title suggests, you read the material and then you summarize it. The goal is to learn through restating the material in your own words so that you actually have to think and not just regurgitate the material. Some questions you might want to ask yourself when using this method is the 5 W's and the 1 H, the who, what, where, why, and how. And keeping in your mind the main ideas and details of the text. You can make annotations in the margins or raise questions that you think might help you later on. I use this method extensively, and I think it was the main reason why I did so well. This is one of my texts for English literature that we studied at A-level, and these are the notes that I made in the book. It looks intense, but if I explain it to you, it will seem much more manageable. What I did was read through the text once, mainly because we had to read it, and then I realised I didn't remember anything that had happened, so I read through it a second time. But the second time that I read through it, I knew exactly what the criteria we were going to be marked on was, and the different themes that the questions could fall into. When I read it the second time, I was able to assign each theme a colour, so green was nature, I think blue was characterisation, I wrote it inside. Yeah, blue is characterisation and identity, and orange was authorial methods. Knowing exactly what to focus on, I would highlight the important quotes, assign it a colour, and write little notes in the margins. But that was only one step. I then took it a step further, but I'll talk about that later because it's actually another active reading method. I don't want to get too ahead of myself. The second method is the memory boost method. This is focused on repetition. It's great for remembering lists, sequences, remembering vocab. I especially used this for when I was studying French. The traditional way of using this method is to have the text in front of you, you read through it, and then you cover the text and you would write out what you remember. Just what you remember, not trying to dig too deeply to remember everything. Then you would look back at the original source, see what you'd forgotten, and then rewrite it, again covering it, and you'd keep doing that until you got it perfectly. Through the repetition, you would remember what it was that you had to remember. Now, through the use of online apps, it's a lot easier to do this method without having to get hand cramps. However, I will say though that when you write something out with your hand rather than typing as you would online on a computer or a phone, you engage a different part of the brain, and so that affects your memory. Especially if you're going to be handwriting in the exam, it might be useful to handwrite the things that you're going to have to write rather than typing it. But if you use apps like Memrise or Duolingo, they do have list making facilities, and then you can go back, refresh your memory. They tell you when you need to review a word, and it's very automated. It's great. I used it a lot. But this method can even be used for reading, not just lists. If you wanted to read a paragraph or read an entire chapter, try to remember the key points and then go back, skim through the chapter and see what key information you missed out. Keep repeating the process, and then you'd be able to remember the book without even trying. And then afterwards you'd have a greater understanding of the text that you were reading. The third method is the think like a teacher / pro method. This method puts your brain into hunting mode. You highlight the important information, answering yourself the question, what would I ask if I were a teacher? You're looking specifically for content that will come up in the exam. You're not looking at any other insignificant material, no matter how interesting. You're just doing this to pass an exam. When doing this, you can look for signposts in the language, such as to contrast. More importantly, on the other hand, this way you can even use this method when you're skimming the text, just looking for exactly what it is that seems the most vital and using that to structure your entire revision. This can be very helpful for visual learners or my fellow dyslexia people out there, because you can highlight the text, underline the text, and then you're making it more visually appealing and easier for your brain to digest that information. People who can't really write in your textbooks, say that you borrowed them from the library like me, then you can always use a pencil and rub it out afterwards, or you can photocopy the pages. My voice. Or you can photocopy the pages and print them out, or just photocopy them and read them online on Adobe Reader or a software similar to that. I know Google Drive has a free PDF reader that you can use if your university doesn't supply Adobe specifically. There are many ways to go about this method, and apparently it's the fastest one for helping you get the information in your brain, which makes sense because you're only looking for material that's going to come up in your exam. Needless to say, I do this a lot, all the time. I have to be very strict with myself because I can go off on a tangent and look at an insignificant sentence and make the most out of it. What's the phrase, make a mountain out of a molehill? I do that. And we often had to do this in our English class at A-level. It was very popular to have the students teach, because when you had to teach something, you had to have a level of understanding of it, and you also had to know what was important to be able to teach it to the class. And so oftentimes we would have to give presentations on a particular topic, but then I didn't have as great an understanding of the other topics because I didn't do the research for it myself. That's due to my own laziness. I should have followed it up, but you know, students. The fourth method is to use mind maps. This is fantastic. It's a fantastic method. It's not just great for visual learners, it's great for kinesthetic learners because you're actually having to use other parts of your body, and the brain reacts stronger to colour than just to monochrome, so you can add in all of the different colours. You can colour code specific topics so that once you glance at it, your brain can already identify what goes where. When you put something down on a sheet of paper and have to pull all the information for that topic, sometimes you can see the connections that you might not have made if the information was just in your head. I still have like some of my mind maps I used from A-level French. I have one that I made for the author of the book I had to study for French. I have ones on grammar. This one's on the partitive articles, and this one's on the causative. All of these grammatical, I don't know what the word is. All of these things to do with grammar, I would just make a poster for it and then put it up. I also had ones for specific essay phrases and different synonyms. And then this is the most important part. I would stick them up in places that I frequented. So I put them on my chest of drawers, my wardrobe, on my desk, like above my bed. So wherever I was looking, if I was in my room, I was surrounded by it, and so my eyes would naturally wander. And even if I wasn't in revision mode, I would be taking in that information anyway. It's great. It's great. The fifth method is the chapter by chapter summary. This is the method I said I would get back to. As the name suggests, you write a summary for each chapter of the book that you have read so that you can condense the information from it, and instead of rereading the book to understand the story, you reread your summary. I did this for Wuthering Heights. And, hold a moment, I did this for French as well, because I gave away my English chapter summary, so I can't show you them, but I'll Ta-da! This is the title of the book that was the study, and I drew little pictures because I like doodling and it makes it much more interesting and intriguing for me. What I would do is read the chapter, put in my little post-it notes. It's a different book, but I put in my little post-it notes with the colours. Actually, get the book. No shortcuts. Okay, so this is the French book. So I had my own post-it notes. I had just highlights, mostly because it's in a different language and I wasn't really analysing it as much. I might write some little notes in the margins there, but mostly I was just highlighting the material and adding colour code. Then, when I went to make my chapter summary, I had over here, do you mind? The key events. This is important information that might not be key events, but essentially analysis that I had picked up or made, something that I knew related to an essay question. And then these are the quotes. And as you can see, their colour code, the colour matches the colour of the post-it notes. Comments on society was blue, and so I would write it in a blue pen. Then when I was looking through my chapter summary, I could see the quotes that I needed to use for each theme that I was talking about. For English, I did it a little differently. I would write the quote and then write a mini analysis of the quote, because the English exam worked a bit differently from French, and so my chapter by chapter summary was a bit different. I feel like the chapter by chapter summary was my favourite method. I had such fun making them. Though it was a bit of a stress, I can't lie, because when I first did it, it looked like this. I only wrote in the specific colour words that stuck out to me, words that I thought would be interesting. If the protagonist was explaining a particular thing, then I would highlight that, and they'd be like, oh, this is like the use of the language here, but it just looked gross to me, so I changed it, and I prefer the way that this looks. Sometimes you might have to go through it and find what works best for you. The sixth method is to create a study guide. This is your own study guide of condensed information that you think will be important. You want to keep it to 2 pages maximum, which means that you really have to be picky with the information that you put on it. What's most recommended is to just put down information that you're likely to forget. There's no point in writing things that are obvious to you at this point, because then you're wasting your 2 pages. And we all love to revise the things that we know because it makes us feel good, but then you go into the exam and you don't feel so good. So make your study guide work for you. This is a side note, but in one of the websites I read, they recommend you record yourself reading the material and then listen back to that recording whilst you're going through your day, whether you're traveling or doing household chores. You're essentially doing 2 revision methods at once, because when you're reading the material, you're taking in some information from that reading, and then you're going to revise it once you're listening through it again, but you can still do other things that you need to do. So it's like a passive learning. Another way you can get around the monotony of reading boring information: read it once, maybe just not taking in most of the information, add in like voices. Did this in English. English essentially was like an extension of drama at that point. Each person had like a character if we were studying a play, and then they would read it in particular voices. And if you record that and then listen back to it, it's like an audiobook. The 7th method is the Einstein method. This method comes from the quote that Einstein said, "If you can't explain it to a 6-year-old, you don't know it yourself." And that's the basis for this method. You have to explain all of your concepts simply, as if you're going to teach it to a 6-year-old. This is great if you're doing oral exams, because when you're explaining something, you have to make it seem simple enough for the other person to understand what you're saying, but also get in those little point boosters that show your proficiency. Many times I would come across a law concept in my textbooks and try to explain it in my own words, but I couldn't explain it exactly, and I essentially just ended up regurgitating what was in the textbook, and that's how I knew I don't understand that well, I need to review that. Also, The website I read talks about predicting as well. So if you're reading something, try to predict what the summary of the information will be or the conclusion of the experiment will be. And then go back, look at the actual conclusion and see how close you are. And if you're studying a subject where there isn't necessarily a right answer, this can still be great for honing your own opinions. Number 8 is the personal connection method. You want to think of an example that relates to you, your life, your interest. You see it so much in the movies where it's like, I'm teaching this guy and he's a football player, so I'm gonna explain maths with like football analogies, and it's like so cheesy, but it does sort of help. If you can explain something with an analogy that links back to your own life or to what's actually happening in the world, then you're more likely to remember it when you go and you think about, I don't know, breakfast. Oh my gosh, that's what we actually did in drama. There's a practitioner, Brecht, and somebody made a joke and said breakfast, and so we would always remember like their practitioner with breakfast. And Brecht was extremism, well, I can't remember the exact, it was extreme, and it fit the vine very well. That made the material more relatable, easier to remember, and I still remember it to this day, so I definitely know it. I just can't remember the exact words, but I remember the key concepts. The 9th method is the Post-it notes method. This one is like the chapter by chapter summary, but you have to summarize it on a post-it note. So it really forces you to only note the key ideas. Then when you read back through the material, you only read the post-it notes. I didn't use this for books because I had my chapter by chapter summary. I needed the depth of analysis, but I did use it for history GCSE. I would write on the post-it notes the dates of particular rebellions or important historical events, and then stick that up everywhere. It was almost like a mind map, but just smaller. When I was around in the place, I would just read it, and then I could take my post-it notes with me so effortlessly, stick them into my textbook, so then when I was flipping through the textbook, I could just look at the post-it note instead of reading the entire book. And the last method is practice tests. Whenever you come across keywords or a question that you think might come up, write it down and add it to make your own mini practice test. I would recommend doing this topic by topic, just because if you did it for your entire course, it might get a bit long. You can test yourself twice, once in the middle of your studies and once after you have learned all of the material. If you're really feeling it, do one before the exam. Not directly before the exam, but like the night before or 2 days before. This really helps to reduce test anxiety. If you've already had your own tests and you know that you've practiced the material to a point where you can write sufficiently, you won't be as worried going in. It's essentially the same as mocks, but you make them yourself. I think this is kind of a given for people who do essay-based subjects, because most of the time you will get sent an essay once a week by your teacher or your professor, and so you're having to consolidate the information all the time. When it came to exam season for me, I was writing practice essays like once every 3 days. It was very frequent. It helped me a lot. When I went into my exam, I had my essay structure down, I knew the quotes that I could use, and the question didn't throw me because I'd seen them all of them. If you're needing help making practice tests, just remember to ask yourself a few questions like, who wrote the text? Who was the intended audience for the text? When did they write it? Why did they write it? Why do you think it was written? Not necessarily why it was actually written. Does it link with any other material in the module? What's the purpose of this text? Is it from a bigger body of work? If so, where does it come? You need to know what happened before and after that text. And that's it. Those are all 10 of the active reading methods that I've come across, and I've used all 10 of them not knowing that they were active reading. So maybe that's the same for you, and if not, then you can now incorporate them into your studies so seamlessly. The term may not be something that you've heard before, but it's probably a practice that you've been implementing without even realising. All of these methods really helped me a lot from GCSE to A-level, and it's helping me now even at university, especially because I would talk with my study skills advisor, and the same information that I'm finding is the one that she's telling me. She also recommends that I have 5 minutes before I read something and 5 minutes after I read something. The 5 minutes before I used to ask myself, what exactly am I trying to gain from this text? If I'm reading something from criminal law and it's a chapter on homicide, I'm trying to find out what's the legal definition of murder, are there any defenses for it? Then when I'm reading it, I can pinpoint the information that I'm looking for. I'm not just reading it blindly, I have a purpose, I have a focus. And then you take 5 minutes after you have read it to summarize the material. Make sure that you do actually understand what you've read and you jot down the key ideas when they're fresh in your mind. Anywho, I hope that that's helped you guys, and I'll see you in my next one. Peace.